So the union budget being unveiled today by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, of course, a lot of focus on what we generally talk about when it comes to the union budget, whether that's on income tax rates, spending on infrastructure, pensions, fertilizers, of course, big issues that always dominate coverage when we talk about the union budget. But of course, this time here at India Today Global, we're going to be focusing a little bit on the Ministry of External Affairs, India's Foreign Ministry. We're going to look at, of course, this increase in the budgetary allocation to 22,000 crores. This time we're going to be breaking down what it means for India's foreign policy with one of India's most noted experts on its policy towards this neighborhood, someone who has studied the union budget when it comes to the Ministry of External Affairs in the past, Constantino Xavier of the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Dr. Xavier, thank you so much for joining us. Just to begin with, if you could give us a sense of anything that jumped out at you from this budget when it comes to the Ministry of External Affairs' allocation, 22,000 crores this time, as compared to what you've seen over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Shashank, for focusing on this. Good to talk to you. Based on the work I've done with my colleague Riya Sinha here at CSEP, I think what's striking compared to the analysis we did of last year's budget is the growth that you mentioned, about 23% in total on the MEA budget. This is the largest amount that has been ever allocated to the Ministry of External Affairs. It surpasses the growth of around 2, 3, 4% of the last many years, 4 to 5 years at least. So this is, I think, really the most important highlight of what we're seeing here. And that makes sense. I mean, India has been pushing around in the world. It's been punching above its weight and many more, signaling its interest to join new institutions, new initiatives, to be predominant leading power internationally and regionally. And to do that, you need firepower. That means people, that means resources, that means a lot of financial might to be able to pursue India's interests and influence in the region in a more competitive, difficult world.
Understood. If I could ask you about that increased allocation, of course, on one hand, would you think, what is jumping out at you in terms of where those increased allocations are going? That extra 4,000 crores last year, of course, it was the budget estimate was around 18,000 crores, but then you also had G20 last year, of course, a 4,000 crore increase this year. So, of course, there's that. Where do you think the additional resources are going? What's catching your eye in terms of where India is looking to allocate its diplomatic funding and capital?
Yeah, just to put this in perspective, Shashank, I think it's important to understand that the Indian firepower still is very limited. To put this in comparative perspective, the US puts in around $45 billion every year into State Department and USAID, the International Development Agency of the US. Compared to those $45 billion, we're talking still of an MEA budget of around $2.5 billion. But given that and the growth we saw this year, which has been striking, I think the most interesting thing that comes out beyond what you mentioned, that of course post G20 there's less funding for the Secretariat, is a shift from grants to loans. This is the type of financial assistance India gives to its neighboring countries, where China is becoming a serious competitor, has often undermined Indian interests, and has parallel financial mechanisms that have either supported these countries, in some cases also weakened these countries. So the only way India can, of course, compete is by having alternative financial mechanisms, whether grants or loans, to support these countries. Grants basically have been projects which are free money for these countries, completely free, but often are given to public sector companies or to local contractors and local companies that obviously don't have a great incentive to perform on these projects because they're getting free money in terms of grants. So if you see the share of grants goes down in India's neighborhood in particular, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, but the amount of loans and lines of credit broadly as another instrument is significantly over the last few years increasing. So for Bangladesh, for example, grants are coming down by 40%, but we see loans and support for Bhutan's hydropower projects going up by 29%.
If I could ask you some questions about this specifically, about the neighborhood and firepower. Let me begin actually with this question that has always come up, which is that the Parliamentary Standing Committee has at numerous times asked the Ministry of External Affairs to consider pitching for the Indian government to fund the MEA to the level of 1% of the budget. Of course, I think this is it still remained at around 0.4% for this year's budget as well, so not much change there. You talked about limited firepower. Is there a reason why India tends to, of course, spend much less? There are of course developmental challenges or so on and so forth. But has the MEA not been able to make that case for increased funding to reach 1% that the Parliamentary Standing Committee seems to ask it to do every time it comes out with a report?
Yeah, I think it's well beyond that 1% of the budget target that the Standing Committee had recommended in 2022. It's stuck, as you mentioned, around 0.4% this year. I assume hasn't risen much more. But look at this from another perspective. The MEA is one among many ministries that are increasingly prevalently engaged abroad in foreign policy. Today, you look at technology, you have a variety of other ministries looking at internationalizing India's digital public infrastructure, the UPA in particular. Today, you look at science and technology cooperation, you look at the energy ministry, you look at a variety of ministries that are also doing foreign policy more than ever. So that's number one. The second caveat I would introduce is that the MEA has had difficulty spending, as many other ministries, its budget. So often the issues are less the amount that you're getting, but how much you're actually able to convert into actuals in terms of deliverables in foreign policy. That relates to organizational issues and capacity issues. Just receiving the money from the Ministry of Finance is one thing, and then finding smart ways that increase India's reach and influence beyond borders is a very different one. So therefore, the difference that goes from grants to loans or lines of credit is an interesting one. What does it tell you? It tells you that today, a record number of private Indian companies are involved abroad. In the neighborhood in particular, we see a variety of companies, not only the big companies in the port sector and the power sector, but also in terms of exports, etc. So you have today private companies playing a much more important role, and therefore you don't need to give grants necessarily to those private companies. You can give small targeted subsidies for Indian companies to facilitate their investments in Bangladesh, for example, or in Sri Lanka more recently. So I think, therefore, you can see that there's a variety of issues that go beyond just the amount you get. And maybe ending on one note, you can see that, of course, the amount, for example, I think on training of Indian Foreign Service officers, training institutions, regional organizations, engagement with think tanks has also increased by, I think, 7 or 8% in this budget. That shows that also the importance sometimes goes into building a stronger ministry with more foreign service officers, for example. I believe the number is being expanded by 20% for the first time this year. And that is a major increase again in that capacity that the MEA then has to find new ways to spend Indian taxpayers' money in a smart and efficient way to pursue India's developmental and foreign policy interests.
Right. If I could ask you another big picture question, of course, while we're getting into the weeds of how India spends its money, one part of the equation is, of course, that we don't spend as much as the Parliamentary Standing Committee recommends that we should. If I could also ask you about the larger financial strategy in the neighborhood. You're someone who studies this extremely carefully in terms of India's connectivity with its neighbors. Oftentimes, a part of the question that is asked, sometimes in despair, is, look, can India possibly match the financial power of a country like China, which has increasingly taken an interest in countries in South Asia, that has been willing to allocate money, whether it comes to BRI projects in countries like Nepal or more generally in Sri Lanka and other countries as well. Do you think that how do you see this particular question about India needing to spend more money and upping its diplomatic expenditures if it needs to take part in a financial competition, as it were, with China in this part of the world? Or do you think that that paradigm of trying to compete with China through checkbook diplomacy doesn't really work in South Asia? Your view on this?
Yeah, great point, because I'm not sure that while I've been arguing and researching and pushing for a stronger Ministry of External Affairs, whether it's in terms of people or budgetary capacity, I think throwing money at other countries is not necessarily the right way or the only way. The Chinese have found out the hard way. The Chinese have showered countries with a variety of financial instruments, loans, grants, etc. And today you see several of India's neighboring countries realizing that that pipeline has dried up. We see the BRI investments have slowed down post-21. Two, that these BRI investments or financial inducements coming from China have come with a variety of conditionalities. Companies from China trying to shape the regulatory environment in these countries, shaping laws, proxy designing new laws in these countries. And the third, that with the money and the investments, often you also had political interference happening from China, that China needed to protect its investments and its assets. So you see that today we've pivoted to many countries actually looking up towards India as an alternative again, and playing that balancing game, as you have reported often very well in terms of detail of how these countries are playing that game. But the point is, India, of course, needs more resources to respond to these countries. And I would say that today the ball is more than ever in India's court. Because maybe 6 years ago, you had many countries such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, turning the other way, embracing China, blindly, in fact. And today they're actually repositioning themselves and realizing that there are limitations to what China can deliver. And therefore, the ball is in India's court and of its partners, because India does this often together with other countries. Japan is a major economic player for India in the neighborhood. The US, the European Investment Bank today is looking at investing in South Asia to support also Indian regional interests. So you have a variety of actors now working with India, and these countries therefore are looking at India and its partners to come in and support their own developmental aspirations in terms of growth. And that for that, you obviously require an economic strategy and economic capabilities here in Delhi that allow you to pursue Indian interests in Kathmandu, in Dhaka, in Male, or in Colombo.
Right. If I could ask you a question and ask you to, because it is your specialization, I am going to take some advantage of that in terms of your work on this particular question of India and China in the broader neighborhood. Of course, there was an interesting bit of news about the Nepal not signing the BRI agreement with implementation agreement with the Chinese, at least before the Prachanda government fell. India, of course, we've seen in the last couple of years, and you've cited that Dr. Jaishankar saying this as well, which is that we need to reopen rail links with our neighbors, build cross-border pipelines, link electricity grids, and so on and so forth. I was wondering if you could explain some of the impetus behind this, new Indian push for connectivity, what the incentives are behind it, and also a little bit of how China has been faring in the region as well. Because as you mentioned very correctly, a couple of years ago, Hamban Tota was on, anyone could talk about debt trap diplomacy. There's a real sense that India was being outspent in the region. You don't hear that as much anymore. What changed exactly, if I could ask you to explain?
I'm not sure. I think one reason is we may often consume the idea that it's only a response to what China is doing in the neighborhood. That makes news. It's interesting. India-China relations have tanked since 2020. So obviously, whatever China does in India's neighboring countries will attract huge attention. Everything India does is seen from a response perspective, a reaction perspective, and a geostrategic perspective. That is an important factor, but I generally like to underline the economic factor first. Why are Indian companies today investing in these neighboring countries? Why are India's border states looking beyond their borders and now seeing in their neighboring countries opportunities for trade, for growth? That is because of the developmental ambitions you have inside the country. India's significant continuous growth at 6% plus. Neighboring countries growing. In fact, South Asia is the only region in the world that has significantly and consistently grown over the last few years and continues to grow. That includes Nepal, includes Bangladesh and Sri Lanka with ups and downs. Of course, Sri Lanka, we saw a crisis. But this is a huge market. We're talking about 1/4 of humanity, and you don't have the basic infrastructure to trade, whether it's borders, checkpoints, railways, waterways that once used to link the subcontinent to transport people and goods, airport connectivity. So you see a rush to develop the basic infrastructure in order to build an economic market. And that's not only a market that India sees in its neighboring countries. It is Bangladesh saying, we want more Indian investments. It's Bangladesh saying, we're worried about the asymmetry in our trade, which has now boomed from 9-10 billion to 18 billion. It's doubled in a few years. But most of it is still Indian exports to Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is saying now we also want to export to India. We want to balance that trade asymmetry. Sri Lanka looking first northwards when the crisis hit. It looked at India and is resetting the future of its economy on the idea that it would be the Indian economy, and particularly southern Indian markets, not only in terms of goods, but also people and services that will develop the basis of a future sustainable Sri Lankan economy. So all these countries are graduating into lower and middle income countries. They're having difficulties to do that. They're seeking investment in finance. They will take some from China. They will keep doing that. But the difference today, I think what's driving Indian response is maybe less the China effect and more the economic growth imperative in line with India seeking to become a developed nation in 2047, which will only happen if it integrates its markets with its neighboring countries. By the way, not only South Asia, but also with Myanmar, Thailand, and Southeast Asia.
And if I can ask you one more question about something that you have written about quite a bit that gets talked about here and there, about the size of the Indian Foreign Service. Some people, of course, pleading the case that the Indian Foreign Service is simply too small. You've mentioned, and we've seen the latest, of course, batches of the Foreign Service, at least the last one, much larger than previous years. Do you think that the Foreign Ministry has woken up to that reality that, okay, perhaps we are a little too small, we need to expand the size of the Foreign Service, or is there still a mindset of incrementalism in the Foreign Service in terms of tackling this issue?
Yes, we've made that argument, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone if you look at a country like India, 1.4 billion people, which has roughly 1,000 full-time serving Indian Foreign Service cadre officers, that other countries have numbers in the thousands, whether it's the US, China, and even other medium powers and regional powers around the world. So running an economy and a consumer market and representing Indian citizens in the number of 1.4 billion people in a very complex, challenging, competitive world, more than ever, requires certainly more women and manpower in the Ministry of External Affairs. That said, let's also account for the new type of diplomacy. This is no longer an era where you have to be humanly present in every meeting room. We've seen a succession of summit meetings that have been held in hybrid or online mode. Diplomacy today can be and is using technology to save in terms of its physical engagements, and therefore can account for some savings on that front. But bottom line, yes, you need much more. And that means particularly in the neighborhood, if you look at the size of India's missions abroad, they are being pushed to the extreme to deliver. Again, for good reasons. Countries are expecting more from India, which is why I mentioned India has been punching above its weight and wants to play in the first league. And for that, it needs now the muscle mass, MEA, defense diplomacy in the MOD budget, exporting. I mean, there's a variety, of course, ways. But in the MEA in particular, it means stronger, specialized missions, specialized cadres of Indian diplomats, whether they know certain languages, whether they're experts in defense diplomacy or in economic diplomacy, in managing the diaspora, right? The more than 20 million Indian citizens that live around the world and require support and evacuation in times of crisis, whether it's cultural diplomacy also, and engaging with new people, etc. So in the neighborhood, for example, which I work on the most, that means getting people from the neighboring countries to spend time in India, to get to know the changes in India and what India has actually meant, because the image is often still very outdated, particularly in the neighborhood, on how India is seen as an older country, as a slower country, or as a regional bully and hegemon, etc. So that's why you need that financial power to convert it into more people and more serving offices from different cadres, by the way, not only from the IFS, but from across the ministries, from across also the government, to serve abroad and strengthen that analytical and outreach capacity to pursue Indian interests in a more complex world.
Right. So laying out for us in a very concise and accessible way what the Indian Ministry of External Affairs has been trying to do with its funding firepower, as it were. We've taken a look here at what the budget allocation is this year for the Ministry of External Affairs, what it's trying to do in the neighborhood, what the future horizons are for the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, and of course also pointing out a little bit of the competition with China in India's backyard. But thank you so much, Dr. Xavier, for joining us on India Today Global and explaining what the budget holds for the Ministry of External Affairs, and thank you again for watching the channel.